Hello and welcome back to the next session. I'm really excited to have the fantastic speakers on board that we lined up for you. We're looking at now the break from dairy, the future of alternative milk in Asia, and what had happened over the last couple of years, and why it is now that this milk alternatives or dairy alternatives are experiencing such a boom and such a holy cow moment, if you will. So I would like to ask my fellow speakers to turn on their cameras so I can introduce them one by one. We do have from Hong Kong, Mrs. Sonalie Figueiras, who is a social entrepreneur and also the founder of Green Queen Media, an award-winning impact media platform advocating for social and environmental change. In fact, they're very focused on the alternative-based food space and looking into changing the consumer behavior through inspiring new original content. So hello to you, Sonalie.
Hello, everyone.
Also on the panel, we have Ignacio Vargas. He's a Mexican but based in Singapore, who's a food scientist with over 10 years of experience, currently working at Matt Johnson, but soon to be the head of product at the Singapore-based Turtle Tree Lab. He happens to be also the fellow of the Good Food Institute, which is the international nonprofit organization that promotes plant-based meats, dairy, and cultivated meats as an alternative to conventional animal products. Hello, Ignacio.
Hello, pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And last but definitely not least, we have Peter Brown, who's joining us from Australia. He has a very rich experience in the FMCG space with over 25 years. And the last 11 of those, he has been with the Australian stock-listed Freedom Foods Group, who is very much in the alternative dairy space, but happens to be also in the dairy space. So he's got basically two hats on, if you will. He oversees all the commercial activities in the business and can give us a fantastic overview of what's happening in the market. So welcome to you, Peter.
Thanks, Carl. It's great to be with everybody here.
Great to have you guys. So before we start, I actually would like to remind everyone how old we are. I want to look at the 25-year-old, I think, commercial that has been aired in the United States called Got Milk. If you recall this one, it's been a very long, very great promotion for the milk industry back then. And I think there has been a lot of change which has happened since then. So I would like to start with Sonalie. I mean, you've had a very good overview of the last decade, what's happening in alternative protein space, since you also did some research in that. But what is your take on why alternative dairy is becoming so hot at the moment, and why is it that it's been such a really prominent topic through and through?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That's such a great question. And there are quite a few elements to answer that. I think we can start with kind of the funnest, which is that the rise of a digital generation that spends their life on social media, which is a very visual and video-based way of communicating, has allowed for us to have a lot more access to transparency of information about where our food comes from. So I think what has really spurred the alt dairy phenomenon is very much the videos of, young calves being, milked, and the conditions that is happening in, and sometimes the cruelty of that slaughter and that process. I don't think many people were as aware of how milk is produced and the constant impregnation of dairy cows and how calves are removed from their mothers and all that. So that's number one. Number two, there's obviously been a huge rise in looking for foods that are healthier for our diets, right? I mean, I would say that the sustainable food craze that is happening now, it has really came out of the wellness craze that happened about 5 to 10 years ago and is still going on. And so people are looking for, let's say healthier foods, cleaner labels, etc. And that is part of where alternative dairy came in. I also obviously think that there's a rise in the environmentally focused generation, along with a lot more reports and scientific research around the cost of dairy to the planet. And I think that that was a huge shift from what we thought 10 years ago, where everyone knew that meat, was not as great, but no one was really thinking about dairy. Dairy really got a pass, and the idea was that dairy is much, you're not really harming animals that much because you're just taking their milk, and you're not really, there's no damage to the planet. And I think that that's an understanding that's completely changed, and an awareness about the emissions that are inherent in a glass of milk. And to go back to your earlier statement about the Got Milk campaign, which I remember very well as an 80s baby, that was a huge campaign. I mean, every celebrity known to the US kind of content universe, which was, sent across the world, participated in that campaign. So that did a huge amount to kind of connect people to, dairy and calcium, dairy and good bones, dairy and health. And just, that has been really reversed by a lot of what is coming out today in terms of research on, is it healthy to consume so much dairy, and does it really help you with your calcium intake and all that? So it's a confluence of factors that have really positioned the alternative dairy to really do well. Now, obviously, I would say a brand like Oatly has also single-handedly had a lot to do with it too, where they've really just made it sexy to drink alternative dairy. And obviously their IPO is happening this week, and it's just a really exciting time for the industry. So it's all kind of culminated here.
It's a really a big thing. I think Oatly has really changed the game there in terms of making it more attractive to talk about it. But it's nothing new. I mean, I'd like to go to Ignacio. I mean, you very well know that the dairy alternatives has been around for many years, like being it cocoa, being it soybeans, being it anything else out there. It's been for many years around. So what is your take on why is it now that it's becoming so attractive or such a big thing? In fact, 4 out of 10 shoppers, according to the research by Euromonitor, already stated that alternative dairy is consumed by people in Europe. So it's almost 50% that alternative dairy is already consumed. But why is it that it's now becoming so trendy and hot?
Well, I think it's just a matter of the consumer being more careful about their food choices. I mean, now we know that the consumers are reading more the labels. Now they are more aware of what they're basically taking. And I mean, maybe also adding to Sonalie's point that, Oatly definitely single-handed exploded this interest in alternative dairy, but as well, I think it goes hand in hand with the alternative meat. The companies as Beyond and Impossible have been really vocal about the benefit of consuming like plant protein products, because this is definitely better for the environment and also towards the health. So I think that all this campaign against the plant-based proteins have been a platform for the alternative dairy to come back, because it has been present since well, many years ago. So this has definitely supported.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I mean, you've been obviously around. You've seen the growth for both, for dairy, and it's still growing a lot, and alternative dairy as well. In fact, your products from under the brand of MilkLab are sold in over 8,000 cafes in Australia alone, and you are expanding in Asia rapidly. So, I mean, we're looking at some model as Oatly. Do you think this could be a model for companies like the ones that the brands that you're working on in the alternative dairy space, or would that not be a good model to emulate?
Look, I think credit where credit's due. Oatly have, to Sonalia's point, exploded this category as such. MilkLab and Freedom Foods, way back, some 30 years in Australia, was market leader in plant milk with soy milk before there were some changes to that category. Dairy was largely for our organisation came after us being a leader in plant milk in Australia. But, in terms of the model and our proximity to Asia, specifically Australia, we're only 13 days on a boat from Sydney to Singapore. We've got scalability in terms of our operation, so low cost. So it's one model that's an alternative for Asia, but ours is a different model in terms of where we're located in proximity to Asia. And I think with our proposition, plant milk is multiple sources of plant milk, not necessarily just oat. So we have the ability to adapt. And as I said, 30 years ago, we were market leaders in Australia with soy milk. Today, we're market leaders in Australia with almond milk. So to have the adaptability to adjust, based on trends is certainly a critical piece.
And just to follow up on this one, I think the growth in Asia is probably the most interesting one. Let's speak not about China, but Southeast Asia and Pacific. And you've obviously been in different markets all over the years and developing the different brands over there. Which markets do you feel are the most interesting ones to explore or distribute the products over there? What are you looking to, where do you look to expand over there?
Look, it's interesting, because we do have a dairy supply part to our business also. You look at the markets in two parts, the developed markets, I guess the sophisticated markets, those with a high GDP, vis-a-vis the markets that are developing. The markets that are developing are where, I guess, Western markets were, a couple of decades ago. Dairy provides good nutritional inputs, rich in a whole range of different nutrients. And so they're developing, like I'm talking about Vietnam and Philippines and some of these other developing markets. So the lead there is dairy, and there's the ability then to, feed in plant milk, whereas developed markets like Europe and Singapore and Australia, the lead is clearly plant milk because there's more advancement in terms of consumers' understanding of those needs. So for us, I think developing markets are quite interesting because there is a response, and you've got, for example, key chains like Starbucks leading some of those directions. So it's fascinating, the ability to be able to convert those developing markets to plant milk consumers.
Mm-hmm. And just in talking about consumers here, I think Sonalie, you've done some fantastic research on that side, and also the preferences on consumer change, and you report on that almost on a daily basis, right? So where do you see is the most exciting market in the alternative dairy space outside of China? And why do you think that, coming to your earlier points, do consumers make the choice now in Asia as well, not just in Europe, but just to switch from normal traditional dairy to alternatives?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. So I actually want to talk about Oatly again on this, because the answer to that question also is very much about cultural and trend lifestyle habits. So I think we really need to discuss the rise of coffee shops in Asia as a huge part of why we're having some of these conversations. As you know, one of Oatly's marketing prowesses is that they go to the barista first, and they convince the barista that their Oatly barista is the best choice for whipping up, delicious lattes. And in the last 10 years, even 15 years, we've just seen a proliferation of this coffee and cafe culture. Which a lot of people, I remember 20 years ago, people were very skeptical about, right? Because traditionally Asians have loved tea and really been happy with Nescafe and similar things like instant coffee products. But if you look at the young people now, the coffee shop culture, both the mass chains like Starbucks, where I think there's a crazy statistic in China, a new Starbucks opens every 15 minutes, and as well the individual coffee shop culture. So, the more hipster kind of, barista-led, this type of culture, that's where I've seen a lot of the alternative milk demand kind of pop up first. A lot of people across Asia, that's where they saw Oatly first, before the supermarket. So there's that side of things. I think there's social media. But in terms of which markets I think are the most interesting, I mean, it's hard to say that Hong Kong and Singapore aren't a huge part of it. Oatly and other competitors are everywhere here. But I would have to say that it does it does have to do with the coffee shop culture, because you know, otherwise Asian consumers to different extent are either buy or don't buy alternative milks as part of their grocery basket. And in Hong Kong, of course, soy milk and freshly made soy milk has always been part of our local kind of grocery shop. So that hasn't really changed, but it's the association of, you know, putting the right, you know, this alternative dairy milk into my coffee or my tea, and it being, you know, something really awesome and wanting to share that on social media. And I think you see that a lot right now in Singapore and China and Hong Kong. Taiwan as well, which has a very strong independent coffee culture. And interestingly enough, I think it's starting in India, which actually is traditionally a very strong dairy market. Despite not being as strong of a beef and meat market, it's a very, very strong dairy market. So I actually have a lot of interest in that market going forward. Obviously not right now with what's happening, but in a few months, you know, when things quieten down on the health front, I do think that you might see some more news coming out there, because what's interesting about the alt dairy industry and the alt food industry in general is that, unlike before, where regional trends tended to be more important in food than not, here you do find this Gen Z and millennial culture that is ubiquitous across country. So there are some similar, you know, let's say your mother and my mother might have come from totally different places in the world and might have had a very, very different cultural reference points, right? But our children or our you know, nieces and nephews are, as Gen Z and millennials, they share a common culture, an Instagram culture, a digital culture. You know, they have the same reference points, and that's why, you know, brands like Oatly and Impossible Foods have been able to have this kind of mass awareness.
They really multiply with all the influencers, the 360 marketing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the
yes.
idea that you would want to take an Instagram of an Oatly drink to show on your social media feed as a status symbol, I think that tells you a lot about where we've come and where we're going. And that tends to be the same whether the consumer is in Taiwan or Singapore or New Delhi. It's the same status, despite in Asia being a more elite choice because of pricing constraints and budget constraints.
Talking about constraints here and bottlenecks, I think I would like to go to Ignacio, because he's a food scientist and he really knows how the things are put together here. So just from a food scientist perspective, where do you see bottlenecks for the plant-based dairy space? Is it like cost parity? Is it regulation? Is it the production process? I mean, we know that there's a lot of talk and look at the precision fermentation, the process that's called precision fermentation by experts and investors, just to ascertain how the future of the lab-grown sector, for instance, is looking like for the likes of perfect dairy milk or better dairy. But what is it that you feel is a bottleneck to grow in that sector?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that, well, separating first the plant-based milk alternatives, the region in Asia is mostly driven by two key factors that are health and indulgence. So in order from a technological point of view or from a food science point of view to be able to accomplish or to achieve these two, I think it's quite a challenge. And this has been one of the bottlenecks. So in order to achieve a healthy product, both in terms of the nutrition and as well on the eyes of the consumer perception, meaning that nowadays the consumer considers a product with a clean label as healthy. And if we see as the plant-based milks, normally they are highly formulated products. So we have quite a challenge there in order to how to decrease this number of ingredients. And by doing this as well, achieving the sensory properties expected by the consumer can be extremely challenging. So from this point, I want to maybe jump to the precision fermentation companies. There are quite a lot of companies doing now solutions for the plant-based industry. One of them is the Australian Nourish Ingredients that uses precision fermentation to produce animal-free fatty acids and combine these fatty acids in order to give to the plant-based product the right sensory profile. And at the same time, they can use this technology in order to design these fats for these fats to give us the best nutrition as possible, meaning to have a lot of omega fatty acids, for example. So in the case now, jumping to the fermentation dairy, I think that the case is completely different. Now, the bottleneck here is mostly regulation. So far, only Perfect Day in the US has achieved to have the FDA approval of their whey protein. And this happens last year. And only in this year is where they are actually like kind of exploring how this product behaves right now in the market. So we can expect these challenges of regulation, not only in the US, but all around the world. And this is going to be the main barrier for all these companies to be able to succeed.
I mean, you sit in Singapore and you obviously are working with SFA and understanding the regulations here. Do you feel that countries like Singapore are adapting quicker to the changes in the food tech industry, or is it more like the US is the frontier there and they're much more swifter in adopting to those?
Well, yeah, definitely Singapore is one exception. Since last year, Singapore with the 30 by 30 initiative, where they want to produce locally 30% of the food consumed by 30% of the population. Thanks to this, they have been quite open to investments and to supporting not only local, but also foreign companies to establish the production sites here. And most importantly, they have been helpful in order to advance in terms of regulation. I think it's quite famous now that last year in December, we got the first approval in order to consume or to sell cultured meat. This was gained by Just Foods. So nowadays, the Singapore consumer can simply order using an app by Deliveroo, the cultured meat, chicken in this case. So Singapore is definitely a step forward. I will say that Israel is as well going to be one of those countries where we're going to see more these changes in regulation and support. So definitely this is going to enhance, to kind of support the whole industry in the region.
So the industry, I mean, the marketplace is getting more busy, right? That's what it basically ends up with. So there's more and more players in the area there. And equally, if you look at, as a response to Oatly, we look at Nestle, who just announced they are launching a new vegan milk drink called Wunder, which is supposed to compete with them. And then you have Danone as well in Europe, that they have the Alpro brand. So my question would be for a big distributor and producer in the dairy and alt dairy space, for Peter, I mean, how do you differentiate your brand in an ever-evolving and competitive market?
Yeah, look, good question, Carl. From a Milk Lab perspective, and I guess I talk to Milk Lab, you know, we are differentiated. We, as a brand and a portfolio, there's nobody else that's doing what we're doing in terms of variety and range. And I guess to Sonali's point before around the barista, very early on, certainly in Australia, we targeted the barista as the point of entry. And our product even today doesn't have a barcode on the pack, so it's not available in supermarkets. It was designed by baristas for baristas, and it's the barista's partner. Its positioning is in specialty coffee, a support to coffee. Coffee's the hero, and Milk Lab's the support to coffee. And it's been developed to enhance coffee, not take over from coffee. And so that's a real differentiation. You know, having the dairy portfolio also allows us to flex around what consumer needs are. And with the brand Milk Lab, it again has flexibility to explore other alternative milk types. And we're doing a lot of exploration at the moment. And again, if you look at the trends, soy to almond to oat, you know, what's around the corner? There's a whole range of different dairy alternatives, and it could come down to sustainability, hazelnut, pistachio, where does it start and finish? So that's where we'll be doing a lot of development work around what's next and adapting accordingly.
Yeah, I think the key word absolutely is sustainability here as well. I mean, there's a lot of drive into that sector, not just only in Europe or in the United States, but Southeast Asia as well, and especially the brands. And I think I'd like to ask Sonalie, because that's one thing very close to your heart, is sustainability. And talking about dairy alternatives, a lot of the products that are plant-based foods are still linked to palm oils to some extent. So do you think it's the right, direction that alternative meats are taking, or trends are taking to be sustainable, or what's your view on this?
So first of all, I'm not fully aware that plant-based meats are connected to palm oil. Maybe one brand, but most of them not really. So I don't know so much about that. So I don't want to speak about something I don't know about, but I have this discussion almost daily on every single panel that I'm on, which is this whole kind of understanding of, processed foods and are we going down the same path and all of this stuff. And my answer is always the same. Once again, if you live a perfect life where you have your own farm and it's organic and you cook all your own meals, and everything you eat is whole foods, plant-based, congratulations. I'm super happy for you. Let's just be realistic about the billions of other people on earth who have budget constraints, time constraints, choice constraints, health constraints, whatever it is, religious constraints, and they need options. And our climate crisis is so urgent and so just worrying on such a big scale that most people just cannot grasp that we need options today. So you can call all these options transition foods, you can look at it however you want, but the reality is that 2 billion McDonald's beef hamburgers are sold every year. And for me, if those are replaced by a plant-based version, it's a net win. All the data that I have seen, all the research that I have seen shows that even though the most processed plant-based meat is better for the environment by leaps and bounds than the most organic grass-fed beef. So again, everyone has their own data. That's the world we live in now. But I look at maybe 20 reports a week, and that's what I can see. I feel like Ignacio from Vargas from GFI would be able to kind of add to that. They also produce report after report and look at all the reports that are coming out in the space. So I think it's just really important to understand, what are we fighting here? What we're fighting is a crisis in rising emissions, and we need to find ways to stem that today. And the reality is that most consumers are not willing to make choices only based on ethics or only based on whether something was grown from regenerative agriculture or not. So we need options today that help us get to where we want to go, which is offering people alternatives that are just as delicious as what they want at a price point that they can afford in a format that makes sense to them and that makes sense to, restaurants and F&B operators and caterers and hotels and, school lunch chefs. We need things that work now. And again, would we need all these things if we had the perfect global food system? No, we wouldn't, but we don't. And also most of us, when given the choice, do not always make the most organic, healthy, ethical choice. I think we like to think that we do, but the data shows otherwise. So I really think it's important to understand what's the context here? What are we fighting? What are we looking to solve? And yes, the palm oil crisis is a disaster, but it's actually much more dangerous in terms of snacks, foods, and chocolate, and body and personal care than it is a crisis in plant-based meats. So I think we should follow those leads much more.
Okay. We're definitely in an industry that employs a lot of people. It's a very huge industry that is going on and continuing. But I think the question for Ignacio would be, do you believe lab-grown foods or plant-based will destroy farming as we know it and save the planet? Or is it, as Sonalie said, it's just a transition food of where we're going with the food sector and the supply chain in general?
I think I will start more or less taking from Sonalie's. And at this point, we know that the total greenhouse emission gases coming from the cattle raised either for beef or for dairy, they contribute to about 4% of the total carbon dioxide equivalent emission. That is around 2 billion tons per year. And when we compare it, when we compare lab-grown food with these traditional production methods, we see a significantly less greenhouse gas emission. I mean, just last month, Perfect Day published their life cycle assessment, and it shows that by producing dairy proteins by fermentation, the reduction of these greenhouse gases emission is at least 85%. And as well, from one of our internal reports of GFI, that you can find as well in our website, it shows that in the case of cultivated meat, the reduction of these emissions is going to be at up to 92%. So, I mean, lab food is one of many other strategies that are needed to reduce these carbon dioxide emissions and also to, well, as you said, to save the planet, but definitely it's not the only one. And regarding the first point, if lab-grown meat or cultivated is going to destroy the farming industry, I mean, that is not really the position of the alternative protein. I mean, it's not against the traditional industry. I think on the contrary, we want companies to get behind this technology. And I mean, and in GFI, we're helping them to transform. And we are seeing that right now, like the corporate engagement has already influenced the biggest companies as Nestle, you just mentioned it, or Danone, that they already have their plant-based products. As well, in the side of meat, companies as Tyson or Cargill, they already invested in cultured meat startups. So they recognize these and the importance of offsetting the environmental impact, and additionally as well, I mean, to satisfy the consumer requirements. I mean, we know that by 2015, there will be 10 million of us, and these current production methods won't be enough to feed us all. So alternative proteins really represent a way to address this growing demand without draining the limited resources that we have. So it won't kill the normal farming, but it will help in order to feed all these additional demand.
Okay, great. I think before we move to the next question, I also like to remind the audience to please send in their Q&A, their questions for the Q&A, and participate in the polling so we can discuss those later on. So thank you so much. Peter, we talked about consumer trends, and I think Ignacio alluded to some of the aspects that are consumers driving towards alternative dairy. So how do you, I mean, you said you work a lot with baristas, the cafe culture is very key to the success of some of your brands, and you have a lot of different brands that are differentiated between each other with the ingredients that you choose for them. So, but what is the biggest pain point when you market them, let's say in Southeast Asian markets? So what do consumers look for? Is it really the taste only, or is it something else?
No, I don't think it's, well, taste is important. I mean, taste is important, but it's depending on the occasion, the usage, as to what is most important. So if you look at coffee replacing dairy milk as an alternative, then what do the consumers see? First of all, they see the appearance of the product and or the baristas. So functionality and performance in a consumer's eyes is critical, and then taste. And taste is interesting, particularly across multiple markets that you enter in, that, you know, taste can be perceived differently in different markets. You know, Sonalie talked about India. India is the largest consumer of almonds in the world, but also the largest producers of dairy in the world. And so access with almond into India is seen to be seamless in contrast to other dairy alternatives. Whereby you go a bit further north into Asia, where Oatly have come from, heading south, and there's a taste profile, and where there's oats are consumed a little bit more for the need for oats. So, you know, trying to, you know, get consistency across the markets isn't easy. And I guess that's where Milk Lab plays a role in that we have alternatives for different markets, right? I think the other thing is that, you know, in terms of occasion, you're right, we have different brands for different occasions. We've got a brand called Australia's Own Organic Plant Milk, and that's a clean label to, you know, to Ignacio's point, simple, clean label, no stabilizers, but it doesn't work in espresso-based coffee because the acidity, so it fails. So you've really got to understand where you're running out, who you're running after, and then how you approach that and adapt accordingly. And that's why we've got multiple brands for multiple consumer occasions. And I think the third point, which is a very interesting one, because, you know, we call this a dairy milk alternative market. So the reference point from a consumer perspective is dairy, right? We're trying to replicate dairy. Otherwise, we would call it something else. And the regulators now are wanting us to call it something else, because using the word milk is becoming a challenge, a pain point. India's outlawed the word milk on dairy alternatives. So you therefore have to then come up with a different proposition. And from a communication perspective to those consumers, and other markets will soon follow suit. So it's quite dynamic in the sense that we're benchmarking dairy as an alternative rather than starting from something else completely away from dairy as an alternative to dairy milk, or mammal's milk, as it were. So I think, and then finally, I'll just finish off on that, is, you know, supply chain and, you know, access in the markets, regulation, registration process, finding the right partner that's going to get you into the particular channels that you want is also critical from a marketing perspective.
Okay, so I think the different markets, including India and the ones that you described earlier, all requested different positioning for different brands and different occasions. And I think Sonalie may be able to allude also to the most exciting companies that are coming out of Asia at the moment, because you are covering a lot of the startups, a lot of the new innovation that is coming up. And I was just curious to learn, aside from maybe China, but other countries do you see produces the most innovative companies out there for alternative dairy at the moment, and why?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm just loving this conversation. It's so interesting. And what's really exciting in the alt dairy space just across the board is the variety of ingredients that we're talking about. And this is where Peter's points are super important, because in the sense of what you're going to use it for, that has to be part of the thinking. And yes, I think I'd like to make a point that all the countries that are fighting alt dairy nomenclature, it shows you a little bit about how strong the dairy lobby is in those countries. So you can sort of draw a parallel. So of course, Europe, certain parts of the US and India, strong dairy lobbies. So very, very exciting. But in Asia, we have a couple of bigger companies like Turtle Tree, which I'm sure Ignacio can talk more about, but obviously they're doing incredibly exciting stuff in the cell-based dairy space. And they're not just doing, you know, replacements for cow's milk, but also for human breast milk, which I think is part of the alt dairy, is a huge subpart of the alt dairy conversation. So infant nutrition. I mean, there's so much that has to be uncovered there. And I know that for parents who are trying to raise a child on a plant-based diet, it is incredibly difficult to find options. Let's say you cannot breastfeed for XYZ reason, and you would like an alternative to cows or goats before the child is 1 year old, which is the critical time for infant powder milk. It is almost impossible to find something that works. The only option you have in Asia right now is soy-based. And if you have an allergy to soy, then it's pretty much non-existent. But there are a lot of startups in this space. In terms of who's around that's on shelves, the players that are in the market, I mean, I feel like Oatly is a Swedish company, but at this point it's building a Singaporean plant and it's been on the ground for a while. It launched in 2018 here. So they're definitely a big player in the space. And there's the other player that we need to discuss is Vitasoy, which is a really interesting Hong Kong based company that, you know, dominates supermarket shelves here and actually has a pretty strong business in Australia. They actually have two different product lines. They have this more local Hong Kong specific product line here, and then they have this organic, much more kind of like Western branded line that they started selling in Australia and have now brought back to the rest of Asia. And they, I think, did not position themselves necessarily as an alt dairy player, but because of the rise of the market, have come back and said, well, we're a heritage brand. So they're a big player. There are a kind of smaller dairy startups, alt dairy startups. So there's something called Oats and Milk in India. And there's a couple of smaller ones. There's also Sophie's Bio Nutrients, And what they do is they've just created the first 100% ready to kind of manufacture algae-based milk. But they're a B2B company, so they're looking to they've created that as a canvas for other companies to come in and use their technology and their algae-based formula. So those are kind of I would say the biggest players. And then you have a lot of the kind of the brands from outside that have made a name for themselves here. Like Califia's here, right? Oatly, the pure So Delicious, which is from Danone, you know, Almond Breeze, all of that. There's also Rude Health that's done really well here. There's also the Australian Bruce, is it Bruce's?
Nutty Bruce.
The Nutty Bruce, they're around. So it's a crowded shelf, to be honest with you. But in terms of homegrown brands that have gone out, it's really just Vitasoy on a huge scale, and then the most exciting from a tech point of view would be Turtle Tree, I would say.
All right. I guess there's a lot coming up. Absolutely. Many new players moving into that space. A lot of money and investment also from MNC developing their own solutions and their own, you know, supply chains that they use in order to bring it onto the shelves very quickly. Ignacio, I mean, at GFI, you guys do a lot of research in that space, especially like what the future scenarios look like, what does the next couple of years look like in Southeast Asia, worldwide, etc. So what is your projection there? How much will the alternative dairy space take over of the traditional dairy space? Where will they stand in the next 5 years?
So, I mean, definitely worldwide, there is a lot of interest in alternative dairy. But in the specific case of Asia, I think that Asia represents more than 60% of the whole alternative milk market in the world. So we need to take into account that it's also a really mature market, especially in China. So, I mean, this growth is not maybe percentage as big as in other regions, but any growth in this 60% of the total market that is at the moment around 11.4 billion only coming from Asia, any growth from this 11.4 billion is significantly increased. So based on Euromonitor data, I think by 2024, they're expecting the category in the whole region to keep growing at a 2% annual growth. And according to these predictions, I mean, this will represent more than 1 additional billion to the whole market. And it's also quite interesting that here in the region, we are only focusing mostly on alternative dairy beverages, like places for milk, but there is a huge opportunity for innovations in yogurt and also in ice cream. If we look at the category launches here in Asia, from the whole alternative dairy, this ice cream and yogurt only represent about 5% of the launches, whereas in other regions like the US and Europe, these represent about 20% each one. So there is this opportunity that by diversifying the portfolios of the current companies, we can expand the overall category of alternative dairy.
Okay, one person I think I would like to ask as well in terms of the growth potential, who has got a lot of experience, obviously, is Peter. And you have different brands that you brought over to the different markets over the years. So what is your prediction, like your alternative dairy products, how will they perform over the next couple of years? What percentage do you reckon will they take of your portfolio and how will they evolve from there? I understand that you have been Freedom Foods has achieved over 33% jump in terms of export sales over the last years, and you won a couple of awards, etc. But where do you see alternative dairy being in your portfolio? What percentage will that be?
Look, at the moment, it's about 25% of our portfolio. That's only going to increase over time. I mean, dairy globally's growth has slowed down. It's very low single digit, whereas for the last decade or so, alternative plant milks have double-digit growth over that period of time. And if you look at Asia, with a 58% of the world's population, and I think the point here is that health trends and access to information, to Sonalie's point, is really the shift. People are now aware of what they're putting in their bodies. and choice is theirs, you know, in terms of, you know, voting with their feet. And so those things, you know, together, the headspace for growth in Asia is incredible. I mean, if you look at Australia, 25 million people, and we launched Milk Lab 5 years ago from zero. There was nobody doing, other than a little bit of soy with Bond soy and some Vita soy in cafes, nobody really doing plant milk in cafe space. And Australia globally has got a very good position around specialty coffee in that high-end cafe market, that trendy cafe market that the world looks on. So, you know, positioning yourselves there off a small population base, and then transferring that, you know, that occasion, that experience, that cafe to Asia, and seeing what we're seeing, it's going to be a huge upside in terms of the future. Putting a number on it, it's going to be more than 50% of our business at a point in time. I have no doubt, you know, with the growth curve that we're on at the moment.
All right. I think that's a fantastic final word. All 50% looking into growing into that market. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone, Sonalie, Ignacio, and Peter, for your wonderful insights, and also thank the audience who hopefully have been sending in a lot of questions who will we answer right after this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl.